Hey, everybody. Welcome to Unwriting the Bible. I just got finished talking with Dr. Susan Niditch, the godmother of the interdisciplinary approach of the Hebrew Bible and oral tradition. She did some of her work at Harvard University with Albert Lord himself. She's written extensively in the field of oral tradition and folklore and the Bible. Her book, Oral World and Written Word, is just a go-to. It's a seminal work in the field. And personally, for me, she was one of the very first scholars to kind of peer review my work. So between her contribution to the field at large and just what she's meant to me as a scholar, I have just really been looking forward to this conversation, and it was a wonderful conversation with a wonderful person. If you don't know who Dr. Susan Niditch is, she is the Samuel Green Professor of Religion at Amherst College, where she's taught since 1978. She earned her Ph.D. from Harvard University's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations in 1977. Her scholarship focuses on ancient Israelite literature and early Judaism, with particular interest in oral traditions, folklore, gender and sexuality, material religion, and comparative religious ethics. She's got a new commentary out on the book of Jonah, and then her newest work, Ethics in the Hebrew Bible and Beyond, from Oxford University Press, that just came out in 2024. So yeah, Dr. Susan Niditch's interdisciplinary approach has significantly influenced the study of the Hebrew Bible, particularly in understanding the interplay between oral and written traditions. So I hope you enjoy this conversation half as much as I did. Dr. Susan Niditch, welcome to Unwriting the Bible. I'm super excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what I would love to do to start off, if anybody listening or watching doesn't know you, is, and I would love to hear this too, is you've written so much articles and books and incorporating into your commentaries in the fields of the Hebrew Bible and folklore oral tradition. And I'm really curious, what your path was to become interested in either or both, and which came
hmm
first, the
hmm
folklore chicken or the Hebrew Bible egg.
hmm
So,
hmm
yeah.
Well, this is a good question. I thought you might ask me that, so I was thinking about that. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, at which time there was a real tradition of Hebrew schools. The one I went to from
Mhm,
maybe the age of 7, on was
mhm,
down the street from me in the kind of conservative denomination synagogue that my
mhm,
family went to.
mhm,
And those teachers were wonderful.
mhm.
And so I started, learning Hebrew and reading the stories. Little kids, they're not going to start you with Leviticus or something,
Right.
from a very early age,
Uh-huh.
and always liked that kind of stuff. And I think kids always like stories. But so that was really very, very much a part of kind of my own kind of growing up. And then I went to university. I always loved kind of history and literature and probably was, going to end up majoring in something like that.
Mm,
But one of the women in my dorm said to me, you don't want to major in English. This was at Harvard, which was an enormous.
mhm,
At that time, there were many fewer women than men. There were maybe 4 men to each woman, but all the
mhm,
classes were, one. And so there were, it was a big university. In the English department, nobody will look at you. There'll be only these horrible, beleaguered graduate students, not horrible because but they're lovely. But even
uh-huh,
then, we're talking in the 70s, they couldn't find jobs. And it was just,
mm,
not, you don't want to do that. So
uh-huh.
she said, don't you know Hebrew? I said, yeah, I did all this Hebrew. She said, well, a friend of mine found this major And at Harvard undergraduates, I don't know about now, but in my day, you had to pick your major at the end of your first year. Here at Amherst, we
Mm,
don't do that until after 2
mm,
years because you know the place. So it was,
right.
she found this major. She ended up not doing it because it was too hard to learn the ancient language so quickly, which I
Sure.
think is
Yeah.
really true.
Mm-hmm.
And it was essentially the study of early and oral literatures, a kind of
Huh.
comp major.
Ah.
And
Well, of
I
course, at
met
Harvard, there with Lord and Perry's. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I met Albert Lord. I went into his
Oh,
study in
wow.
Widener Library and I fell in love with him. He was the dearest, dearest man.
Huh.
And he was really one of my main mentors. And I stayed actually there for graduate work by the time I got into Near Eastern languages, but I still did lots of teaching for them. I was a
Uh-huh.
tutor in their department, which is sort of like a graduate, again, one of these graduate students is doing some of the teaching and
Uh-huh.
guiding graduate theses and stuff. And that was it. And there were very few people. It was a small major. One of my friends did stuff in Old Icelandic. Another
Uh-huh.
one did stuff in Anglo-Saxon. And we had
Mm-hmm.
these various comparative literature courses. And then I had the chance then also to meet Frank Moore Cross, like as a
Oh, sure.
sophomore college.
Wow.
So he was a big man. And he was a good friend of Albert Lord's. And he was very interested in all of that. He
Hmm.
was interested in epic. He was interested in
Mm-hmm.
poetry. Um, I also studied a great deal. So you're really seeing who shaped me with Isidore
Mm-hmm.
Tversky, who's
Mm-hmm.
known for being a Maimonides scholar, but he was a wonderful Midrash scholar. And I didn't
Hmm.
read medieval stuff with him. I read Midrash with him, both
Mm-hmm.
from probably my sophomore year in college all the way, through graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how I ended up doing what I do. And
Mm-hmm.
then it made a lot of sense to, see one in terms of the other, to see things
Sure.
comparatively
Yeah.
in an interdisciplinary way. We did lots of anthropology, we did lots of sociology. What are the contexts? Of course, that fit with Gunkel and all. I mean, there are always
Mm-hmm.
ties between all this. And then really, I've been at Amherst pretty much my whole career.
Mm-hmm.
And that was great too, because it's a comparative religion department. And that gave me an opportunity to teach with colleagues in South Asian religions or who do Islam or Christianity. And so I think a big part of the kind of folklore thing is always to think both in terms of multiple disciplines in an interdisciplinary way, but also comparatively. And we
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
an intro that I've been part of many times where two of us man it. And the most recent one I was involved in was on the end of the world, only appropriate for now. And I did have a
Yeah.
friend, who does kind of more contemporary Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
American religions. And I did, my stuff. But, you again share reading lots of methodological stuff. So if I had been a sort of straight kind of Near Eastern languages person, I'm not sure I would have fit as well into this department, but also
Mm-hmm.
being in this department reinforced. I'm the only really Judaica person. So I always
Mm-hmm.
teach rabbinic literature. So I've kept my hands in that too. And you'll notice a lot of stuff that I write, I'll say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is, I can't resist saying, how it ends up being used later.
Uh-huh.
And also is probably a very, in many ways, oral traditional, process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of these things were probably sermons, they're straight midrashic stuff and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's it. So it's not, there's no magic to it. That was it. It was, my own background and the kind of, I think your undergraduate education is very formative if you become an academic. I noticed that when we hire people. I've been here
Mm-hmm.
such a long time that I've gone through a lot of searches and stuff. And in
Mm-hmm.
our own department, you can really tell, what people, how they were shaped initially. And it sometimes makes for a better or worse fit for the kind of thing that we do. So
Yeah. Well, that is wild. I mean, that's so. I probably should have known that. Probably should have came across it at some point that you worked. I mean, you worked with, studied under Lord. That is,
yeah.
I have I put together kind of a little theme song for the podcast. And actually, I got permission from Harvard to use a little snippet of one of the original recordings of
On the
a
with the goose
goose
lee in the
lay.
background. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then
Great.
to make it, I fed that into an AI
Mm-hmm.
music op
Mm-hmm.
creator, and
Mm-hmm.
it created a song based on that
Mm-hmm.
goose lay. So yeah, the
Oh,
opening to the podcast is
fantastic.
it
I look
begins with
forward to seeing that.
yeah.
Yeah, and he also had a colleague who ended up going elsewhere. His name was David Bynum, but also was a wonderful scholar, a classicist, but also knew all the Serbo-Croatian type stuff. He was really
Mm-hmm.
kind of student.
Mm-hmm.
And I studied a lot with Paul Hansen too. May he rest in peace.
Mm-hmm.
He was a young, very young professor when I was an undergraduate. And that I think that also solidified my interest in this in late biblical and in apocalyptic and stuff, and that stayed with
Mm-hmm.
me too. But really, I really am then just the because of who I studied with, and I guess what I also enjoyed. I was gravitated toward them, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Has it been frustrating for you at all to be like at the ground level of this? I mean, it's like discovering electricity. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but for me, like, oh my goodness, like we've got to look at human communication
Right.
in terms of the cultural realities of
So true.
and
Yeah.
then we come to the biblical text, and we study it as text, and it's like,
More and more so, to tell
whoa,
you the truth. I think that, in fact, there is a huge trend now in both in Judaism, in ancient most Judaism that I study, but also in early Christianity and New Testament, to ask, like how the Bible became a book. The interest is in
mm,
how much is it like a book, and when did it get written down, and and what are its writerly, kind of qualities. And those
right,
are there, and that's important. I think David Carr does a really nice job of kind of bridging those two.
yeah,
But yeah, I don't know why more people have not have been, haven't been, especially sometimes I just feel like, I do what I do. Um,
yeah,
but I don't feel as if I've been that big of an influence, I think people have read stuff, but I think then when I look at, the journals and stuff, people are just interested in other questions these
yeah.
days.
Well, yeah. Well, in the field, of course. I mean, oral world written word from for, is seminal. Like it's people are going to be reading that for. I mean that's for me. That's like Valhausen's prolegum. For a scholar, I'm horrible at recalling details, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, for
Well, thank you.
sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
I'm
Oh, I was gonna.
glad that you find it useful. And I do sometimes at scholarly meetings, people come up to me and they say, "Hey, I really enjoyed, young
Mm-hmm,
scholars like that." And I get, emails and stuff. And so that makes me feel good. I think part of it may be too that I have taught undergraduates for my whole career.
mm-hmm,
That Robert and I both had opportunities to go elsewhere over the years, but we just love it here. It's a beautiful,
mm,
beautiful town. Our kids love, growing up here and going to
mm-hmm,
school here. Our colleagues were lovely. Now, I'm at the other end of my career, and one of my dear colleagues have passed away or
mm,
moved away, and it doesn't feel quite as welcoming, a place as it
mm,
did, even 10 years ago. Um, but I think that's probably been true too, that if you're in a graduate program and people are writing dissertations under you, they,
mm-hmm,
maybe gravitate to you, and then, the ball gets rolling. When you're just, even no matter how much you write or participate, if you're just teaching undergraduates, I think they enjoy it. I think, I do lots of
yeah,
like Folklore in the Bible courses, and, I think they take that with them in other walks of life. So probably even more important, given the job market, I'm probably having
right.
a wider influence. But I think that may have something to do with it too.
Sure. Well, we're gonna crack this egg open, and we're gonna get the word out, because it's. I was thinking about how people like biblical scholars, we strive and strive and strive with this textual mindset. We've got to get back to this original text,
Mhm.
and so we create
And of
these
course, there's
critical.
never an original text. That's the
That's
thing,
that's 100%. And I love.
even
I
in
was
text.
I was getting to one of my favorite quotes from you. Is because we want to get this original text, and
Yeah.
New Testament scholars will say we're 98% sure we have what
Right.
the original text.
Oh,
When I love what you said is you said I don't something, and I'm going to paraphrase you. I don't care so much to look at a critical text because a critical text was never alive in a community.
yeah.
As
Yeah.
far as we know, in
Right.
theory, it was at
Right.
one,
Right.
but I want to pick up a manuscript and think about the the tears and the laughter and the joy that surrounded this performance as it was read to people. That's not exactly what you said, but that's what I heard. That's what I experienced when I read your words
That's
on it.
good. Yeah, I also I remember last year I was teaching one of my rabbinic classes. It was a nice small seminar, lovely students, um, one of whom was fairly pious in
Hmm.
Judaism,
Hmm.
and I was saying to them about a particular midrash. You know, there are manuscript traditions in which it doesn't say this; it says that. You know,
Ah,
they have
yeah.
the, and it was like, she said, "What? There are manuscript traditions?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Even this Bible that I'm using."
Mm.
Some old guy, decided
Right,
this is
right.
the best. And then if you look at the bottom, there are all these other not even just, oh, well, this is the Greek tradition and no, even in the Hebrew tradition, if you go to
Yes.
Berlin or you go to, it's going to be, it was like mind blowing in a bad way for this person,
Oh,
you know. Well,
yes.
that's it is, and that's it. That the tradition always exists in multiplicity,
Yes. Yeah.
even once it's written.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and let alone if we look at, Qumran and the Greek manuscripts, and that alone is proof. But even within, each of those.
Yes, for sure. And it makes it more, for me, it makes it more beautiful. It's a community. It's
Yeah,
not
it's
this
living. Yeah,
top-down
yeah,
elite ruling
right,
class.
right.
It's
Yeah.
living. It's like, yeah. Well, to get some, I want to learn this from you as well because I've come at this very much from, oral tradition, and as I've processed, I really think a lot of it has to do as much with our the distinction between our Western, post-Renaissance, Enlightenment, of
Hmm.
course, post-Gutenberg, Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, like all of this, we just think a certain way, which is not how most oral traditional cultures or even third world country,
Hmm. Hmm.
populations today think. But 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 I've always come at this with orality, oral tradition. But you seem to use a word a lot in your writings, even recently in your 2018 article, which is folklore. And so, can you help me understand what like in an academic sense, what is folklore, and where does that fit? Is oral tradition within folklore, or is folklore underneath tradition, or are they synonymous to you, or?
I think folklore is maybe a genre word that
Mm,
implies a lot of that. Probably there is a lot of oral traditional input, that it's traditional literature,
mm-hmm,
that it's a kind, and it comes in many different genres, right? Many
mm-hmm.
different genres, and within genres, if you're with narrative, many different kinds of traditional stories
Right,
that,
right, right, right.
I know Vladimir Prop had his one basic thing from lack to liquidation, but I think it's got a more complicated than that.
Mm,
Um, but the Hebrew scriptures, when you read it, or any other, traditional collection, there are kind of ways to describe certain things. There are
mm.
certain things, if one thing happens, something else is going to happen. And it
Uh-huh,
may
uh-huh.
be, different words may be used and stuff. But that for
Mm-hmm,
me is the mark of folklore. Need it be
mm-hmm.
oral? No. I could write a story like that myself, now, and
Right,
Lord
right.
knows, am not working in oral tradition.
Mm,
It has to be orally, you have to know that it, came from someone. Maybe if it's in a poetic form and is more stylized and actually using formulas and that kind of
mm-hmm,
thing.
mm-hmm.
And go, and again, there's a whole trajectory from things that, again, as Albert Lord, did, counting, how formulaic is it, and so
Uh-huh,
on, and are there variants
uh-huh.
on formulas or not? But really, when we
Mm,
talk about folklore, we mean traditional style, and those are cross-cultural. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I've been writing an article for a festschrift article for a friend of mine who's retiring, and I'm just looking at certain what Alter would call type scenes,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the heart really of
Uh,
traditional style literature.
uh-huh.
Uh, People pictured a certain way, people doing a certain way. I mean, it's always going to be the unlikely hero, who succeeds
Uh-huh.
the younger son in Israelite material.
Uh-huh.
Um, there are different genres of these. There are trickster stories. There are different
Mm-hmm.
ones. There are stories that accrue to women, you wonder maybe those were women's literature that they enjoyed sharing and telling and somehow got, in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's it. That, in Hebrew scriptures, women are always going to be found by the well,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
youngest sons are always going to succeed. And there's
Mm-hmm.
some of these things are culturally bound, but some of them seem to be, again, almost universal.
Hmm.
And, it's sort of like Joseph Campbell kind of universal
Uh-uh.
that
Sure.
you found certain patterns of the hero or patterns of um, and yeah, I think that stuff is all folklore.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it, will differ from culture to culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the languages that it's in and the particular, worldview, things that are important culturally. Not every culture has the same marriage customs or the same,
Right, right.
but I was the other day, in this article that I'm writing for I'm looking at some of these, again, type scenes. The woman at the window is one. And another one I'm looking at are bereaved women. It's a sort of gender, there's a lot of gender stuff in it, bereaved women and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is bereaved mothers. You have
Mm-hmm.
Niobe in the Greek tradition. You have a number of child ballads in the English tradition.
Mm.
So similar because it's human experience, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah, yeah.
worrying about your dear son or sons, and they go off. Are they going to come back? And it's remarkable how, and that's why you can have something like you've probably heard of Stith Thompson if you've read my stuff, and he has
Mm.
these type indices and
Oh,
motif indices,
yes. Yes.
he thinks he
Yes.
can find. And the reason these folks did it, it was called the Historic Geographic School. They really
Mm.
thought they could, if they got enough versions of something
Right.
that you and I would call like the Cinderella story, they could
Uh,
tell where it started and how
Track
it
it down to
spread. It was, yeah. I've
the
never
Ur
been
text.
that.
The Ur.
Uh,
Yeah.
but they're extremely useful
Mm-hmm.
as kind of collections to how universal is this story? Kind of things like Daniel 7
Mm.
or Genesis 41, which are
Mm.
certainly versions of each other, where you have
Mm.
even specific motifs. There's a dream nobody can solve. They find the outside guy. He's able to,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
God's help, blah, blah, blah. And this is our Israelite version of it, probably centuries apart. But you have essentially that story,
Mm.
all over the world. Difficult
Mm.
problem no one else can solve. They find some outsider, unlikely hero. They bring him in through either his own smarts or some kind of helper. He is able
Mm.
to solve it, and there you have it. So, yeah, I think all of that comes under the heading of folklore. Some people, like Alan Dundas, have even tried to do some of this with proverbs. I don't know, it's a little harder with proverbs. Proverbs tell a very brief, story
Sure.
in
Sure.
short, and are maybe much more culturally bound than
Mm.
implotted stories. But
Right, right.
um,
So it sounds like so when we're talking about, oral traditional material, and I used, for me, that's, I'm thinking about through like Foley, like Foley's eminent
yes,
art. And so
yes,
the traditional part of that is, that's this, circumambient tradition where
yes,
someone gives a performance and there's a
yes.
whole tradition of understanding what the type scene
Behind it, right.
means,
Even
how
the
it's interpreted.
colors. Remember the stuff he does with
Mm.
green, with other things, the monster has this, when
Oh
this
yeah, yeah.
word green is found, everybody.
Right,
And these
right.
are keys to the people within that culture. And that will differ from culture to culture.
Well, so
But
that's the traditional. For what I hear you is so there's this traditional idea of all of the things that define a performance and interpret a performance is all wrapped up in tradition. And for me, it seems like the folklore is looking at the connections across cultures of these same types of stories and experiences.
Yeah,
Is that?
I think that's I've never thought of it that way, but I think that's probably true that every culture has folklore, and it's probably true that especially in narrative traditions, that a
Mm,
lot of these are going to sound, familiar. Sometimes not. I remember my kids always loved folk tales, especially my eldest one,
mm,
um, my eldest child. And I would read her these things. And the European ones looked a lot kind of like, ancient Israelite type stuff.
mm,
Sometimes you have books from Japan, and the plots were not quite the same. Although
mm.
she in fact ended up a scholar of medieval Chinese literature, and a lot of the story
Oh,
patterns she
wow.
has are a lot like, yeah, as weird as her parents, but in a different discipline. The professor too. But yeah,
Well, that's so. Um, why do you believe it's important to study the Bible through this interdisciplinary approach that incorporates folklore studies?
yeah.
Like
I
what?
think
Yeah.
yeah, I just think it renders the material much more meaningful to
Mm,
see it in a cross-cultural, humanistic
yeah.
uh, kind of way, right?
Mm,
In fact, the same paper I mentioned to you I'm working on, I've been really interested in is how these biblical writers um, show their characters even within the contours of not terribly regimented, but traditional style
uh-huh.
type scenes. So you kind of
Right.
know what's going to happen. They are able to make their characters, come alive and
Mm-hmm.
show emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and also make us feel for
Uh-huh.
them, uh, produce empathy,
Mm-hmm.
sympathy, even in characters that we should hate.
Mm-hmm.
That they are capable, we maybe have a grudging admiration. So these women at the window, one of these women, of course, is Jezebel. We
Mm-hmm.
should hate Jezebel. I mean, she's horrible, right?
Right.
In every way. But man, she puts on that makeup,
Mm,
and she says to the people who are coming to get her, "You're like a nobody.
mm,
You're like Zimri, who
mm,
was underling of his master and overthrew him, and that's what you're like." And they then throw her to her death. And you end up, you don't like her, but you have this kind of grudging admiration for her,
mm,
they draw that out of us.
mm,
And it's the same thing with Sisera's mother. She's the
mm,
enemy's mother,
mm.
and has
Right.
these, but she's trying to make herself feel better because she's doesn't realize it yet, but she's going to be a bereaved widow when she
Mm,
finds out. And
right.
so that has brought me even beyond folklore. I've been reading stuff by people in English, study English literature, on how do writers
Mm,
make us feel sympathy, even for characters that we should dislike.
right.
So I think it's a universal kind of humanistic thing, actually.
Mm,
Anytime there's sort of character creation, storytelling involved,
mm-hmm.
and the ancient Israelite stuff will be more formulaic, right? Because
Uh-huh.
there are these kind of type scenes, and you have certain expectations and stuff. But even within that, you feel certain things for these characters because the writers are so good and so
Mm,
skilled. So
yeah.
ultimately, that's what it comes down to. It's not, and they're different. They're different. I don't know who all these writers are,
Mm-hmm.
but I love whenever I teach this material and also I write about it, how conflicted the people who put together the Davidic narratives are.
Mm.
That is, I mean, he's David. What do you want? He's
Right.
King David. You're looking for a new David, but he's horrible. And
Right.
you really you really feel, and he knows sometimes he's horrible. He feels a
Mm-hmm.
little guilt about it. One of the other people I studied with a bit, he died actually soon, I think, right when I began graduate school, G. Ernest Wright, but he was wonderful too. And I went to an
Mm-hmm.
undergraduate course
Mm-hmm.
that he taught, and I always remember his saying about David that he's awful, but he's capable of repenting, when it's convenient,
Yeah.
but it is whoever writes these composers are really, really talented. And what's
Mm.
remarkable is, as you were saying, it's passed through a lot of hands, right?
Uh-huh.
It isn't just like one writer and you send your thing to Macmillan and, out your novel comes for people. It's been, and yet I don't know where it comes, that voice is still
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
creating characters and making us, respond in various ways
I love it
to,
so much. I come from a pretty conservative background, and you know, they, I would hear people, I can hear people say the Bible's not folklore; it's Holy Scripture, right?
yeah,
And but boy, that robs. Maybe that's a false dichotomy, but approaching it as a false dichotomy can rob us of the beauty of stepping into the humanity and the shared humanity
exactly.
across cultures. You use an example in one of your articles of the parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on
Yes,
edge, and
yes,
like the theology is like, oh, so children are punished for their parents' sins,
right,
but no longer. And so they were trying to create some kind of theological
right,
truth to apply to our liturgy
right.
when it's like, no, they were trying to figure out how to process the trauma,
Exactly.
and we
Yeah,
all
Clifford
do that
Geertz
as
was
humans.
a big influence on me there too. This whole
Mm,
business of that, wanting to believe that somehow God is not mad. That's his
mm-hmm,
phrase.
mm-hmm,
That there is that you can make sense of it, uh, you can endure it, and that somehow it's fair. And we're
yeah,
always juggling those
yeah,
when life gives us problems, which it always does.
yeah,
And I think with those, that what I felt then I still feel now when I wrote about it, the Ezekiel, and Jeremiah uses that too,
mm-hmm,
is that you
mm-hmm.
really, people would agree it wasn't fair, but at least it explained
Right,
why. I mean, it's the same thing with the story of the Garden of Eden. It was so long ago, but
right,
okay, I at least
right.
I know why I'm dying.
Yeah, yes, yeah, it provides a framework to sit in the midst of the trauma that you're experiencing, and that what a human experience, and like
Yep.
whether you see it as Holy Scripture or not, it's a human experience that we can value, and I would say, I'm gonna just let me preach for a second, is if your Holy Scriptures aren't raw and baptized in real human experience from blessings and curses
Mhm.
and praise and hatred, then it's not true to the human
Mhm.
experience, and what good is it?
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's that this is a new thing for me today to really understand that that your emphasis on folklore brings this Holy Scripture down to something that can be real
I hope
for
so.
any human who reads it.
I hope so. Yeah, I think that's true. I think, one of I we're now having pre-registration, and a ton of kids have signed up for this course I call Beginning the Bible, which is just
Mm,
reading, it's really sort of the earlier part. I do a lot of stuff on late biblical, which is,
mm,
the whole, exilic, post-exilic period. But this one is if you want to, let's start with Genesis and we'll read it on through as far as we
mm,
get. And students really love that, enjoy that, and I really enjoy teaching it to them.
mm,
And often, as we say, because there are these traditional narratives in it, and things that all humans worry about, it's kind of more
Mm-hmm.
familiar than they think.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Yeah.
that many people come to my courses now who are coming from reading a lot of this stuff. Maybe you would have when you were young, and I would have when I was young,
Mm-hmm.
right? From our own traditions. But most of our students, most of
Mm-hmm.
my students
Mm-hmm.
here at Amherst, that's not the case. They feel I should you recognize biblical allusions in
Right.
literature.
Right.
It sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then they end up enjoying it just for itself as a kind of literature. Um,
Yeah.
so
Well, and it's funny, isn't it funny? Like, this literature was comparative in its day.
absolutely. And
You know,
cross-cultural, that
exactly.
that
Yeah.
huge Levant, I mean, no question about it.
Yeah. From the law
Your neighbors
codes.
would have known what they
Yes.
were talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Which and like, how can you not read? I mean, it brings so much light to the text when you read it like that. When you read, that the Spirit hovered over the deep.
Hmm.
Well, that's Tiamat, you
Hmm.
know, and why they just spoke that word Tiamat in their creation story, and
Hmm.
so now anybody who's hearing that story is going to hear it with, okay, we're going to hold these two stories. I'm hearing this
Hmm.
story, and I've got this
Hmm.
one activated in my head. What does that do?
Hmm.
You know, and
I always, again, when we have these kids read these things, we have them read some ancient Near Eastern stuff too, so they
hmm
get a contextual sense of it. Some of them you'd be surprised, even in high schools, they'll read the Gilgamesh epic because it's such a great story. Um,
yes, yes.
that they're familiar with when they're already come to college. But
You know what's been kind of interesting to me is so I come from a very conservative Christian background, which is very much like, we're not going to let the scholars tell us how to read the Bible. We're gonna, and it's a very locked in, um, um, and then there's these old school biblical scholars that are, it's the documentary hypothesis or nothing. And we all know how the telephone game works. We don't need this oral traditional stuff. And what's funny is, like, both of them, both of those sides, and they would not agree with each other, but they're both being dominated by the modern Western post-Renaissance
yeah, yeah,
philosophy. That they're absorbed in their culture ethnocentrically,
yeah.
not able to open their minds to understand what we have came from a totally different way of looking at daily life, pursuit of truth. I mean,
And it's
it's
it's certainly another really interesting thing too is, of course, that the majority of people would not have relied on writing. I still believe
uh,
that the way we do.
100%. Yeah.
And what that means is for this stuff, which still really smacks of the utterly traditional, to have been
hmm
written down, has to have been written down by elites who did have access
Yes.
to writing, right?
Right.
So that's really interesting too, is how you think of those few things, that
Sure.
they are still uh, writing the stuff down as if it's really traditional literature with appropriate repetitions and the
Uh-huh.
sort of
Uh-huh.
stories that go a certain way, and they
Well,
don't try to do a whole different thing.
and it was written like, even the elites writing it, they weren't writing it for a few other elites to read quietly in the rooms. Like, Carr, I mean, others have said this, but Carr really opened my eyes to this. Is it was written down for the purpose to be read out loud,
Yeah,
or performed out loud, like a
right.
memory aid. And
Kind of
there's
like Ezra,
yeah,
reading. Yeah,
of course,
yeah,
yeah, or Jesus standing up in the synagogue, and like,
right,
that's just what
right,
they did.
right.
And Carr pointed out that there's one copy of the Book of the 12
Uh-huh.
that doesn't even have every word written, but it's the
Mm.
first word of every verse,
So it's just a reminder, a
and then the
mnemonic.
first letter
Yeah,
of each.
yeah,
Yeah, like, I mean, what, and so then what does the word literacy mean
right,
there?
right, right, right,
It's
right.
it's a totally
Yeah,
different
people have
ball
done that
game.
with rabbinic literature as well, all of
Hmm.
this Agadic stuff that is, and they clearly had some form of Hebrew scriptures completely committed to memory. It's
Uh-huh.
not like
Yeah, sure, sure.
when they were talking about something, they were flipping through their Torah,
Right.
scroll or manuscript
Yeah.
to find the thing. It was all, in there when they'll say like, oh, well, there are four verses in Hebrew scriptures where this word is used. And it's part of their kind of, it's scholastic knowledge, but it's also
Hmm.
kind of more of an oral traditional thing that they
Yeah.
have it there.
Yeah. Too many
Yeah.
Christian scholars, and maybe this is, well, I'll just say for me, it wasn't until recently that I realized how big a Torah scroll is.
Yeah.
You just don't turn the page in
And
that
that's just the
willy-nilly.
five books.
Right.
Forget about looking at, other stuff, right?
Right.
Absolutely. Very heavy.
Well, and you brought up this idea that what was written down was what was usually heard. Even when it was written down, it was going to be heard out loud. I mean, silent reading is attested, but it's not the normal. Like most people throughout all of human history didn't sit down and read their definitive traditions; they heard them.
Mhm.
And so there's some scholars that will have argued that features like repetition, structural patterning, aren't reliable indicators of oral or folkloric origins. Like when you read a text that, well, just because it has those features, well, you can't just automatically say that comes from a folklore oral traditional background because a literature, modern literature can do the same thing. And so for me, I want to know what the text means for me today. And
Mhm.
so for me, I think since folklorist traditions, oral traditional cultures often use these repetitive structures, that when I'm reading a text from that culture, I'm gonna look for these types
Mhm.
of repetitive structures.
Sure. Sure.
But some people will say that's not an appropriate way to look at the text. What do you think about that? Because what they're worried about, and here's why they say that, is because we've learned, since Foley, that we shouldn't look at a great divide
Mhm.
between orality and literacy.
Mhm.
And so they're saying, well, if you do that, you're expecting a great divide between oral communication and written communication. So we're not going to have this great divide theory. But I'm like, yeah, but you can't
There's
just
not a
erase.
great divide, but there's a spectrum. I think
Mhm,
it's more of a spectrum than, some things are going to be more oral traditional than others, right? In
mhm,
style. If they
mhm,
were all done in writing by writers, right?
mhm.
Um, you will have, there's a difference between Shakespeare and E. E. Cummings, right? I mean, that you
Right.
have, a sort of scale of or a spectrum. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem, the dots don't seem to connect to me to, we can see this in modern text saturated cultures, therefore looking for it in text stemming from ancient oral cultures is expecting a great divide. It's I mean, and from your experience, isn't it like kind of a agreed upon observation that oral traditional cultures communicate with these types of formulaic language, repetition, structural repetition, even things like chiasms, and isn't that like normal enough to expect in the texts that we have from those cultures?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's really interesting. Sometimes too, these texts can be, really long. Like
Mm-hmm.
Albert Lord, insisted that his Serbo-Croatian people with the Goosleys
Mm-hmm.
were composing on the spot. but
Mm-hmm.
it could take hours and it would be pages and pages of
Mm-hmm.
transcription afterward. Um, there's a certain amount of memorization in it.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes, not every word would be the same, but when he'd
Right,
listen
right.
to a singer sing it two times, oh, they do their shtick kind of that
Uh-huh.
way, describing Marco Kraljevic, going somewhere or something like that, and you do it enough times and perform it enough times.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain variations, you're not hemmed in by it, but probably you do it sort of the same way. So again, there's a kind of spectrum
Yeah.
of possibilities of not being utterly hemmed in by you know again, if you're doing Lord stuff or you're doing Homer, there's going to be a length of the lines, there's going to be a metric issue, there's going to be that. But even that, if they do them often enough, probably those look pretty much the same each time because it
Uh-huh.
worked and they've
Uh-huh.
performed it many times. So is it orally composed anymore? By the
Right,
10th,
right, right.
100th time they've performed that
Right.
song. Again, it's probably not exactly the same. That's the thing. So there'll be some
Mm-hmm.
variations, do it a little, and you don't feel, oh, I made a mistake. I have to go back. It's not like when you're reading or something and you make a mistake
Right.
and you have to go
Right.
back and correct it. But I think that these things can be long or short. They can involve, variation and seemingly kind of exact repetition of certain formulas to describe certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and to some extent, we find hints, it seems to me, of all of that in Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it was Lori Honko that
Yeah,
he did I forget where he did field work on. I've got all my notes written on my
like a
walls.
Scandinavian kind of
Was that well he went I think so.
hunko with a line through the O.
I think so. Well, but
Yeah,
he went and he was hearing all of these, bits and pieces, metonymic,
right. Metonymy. Yeah.
performances.
Yep.
And he said, well, do you ever perform the whole thing? And they were like, that was the whole thing was kind of like a thing to process.
What is the whole thing? Right.
Like, and right. And then they said, well, we can do it for you. Like, we don't need to do it when we perform
Right.
part of it, like people were experiencing all of it, but we'll do it for you. And it took like 6 days. And it was,
Yeah. Well,
um,
that's it.
someone told me it was Paul Eddy. He does work with the historicity of the synoptic tradition and whatnot. And he incorporates studies in oral tradition and that. But he said it was almost like to the word the same length as Homer.
Hmm.
And but it took like 6 days to perform. And we thought following Gunkel, well, these just have to be little bitty stories, like
Oh yeah,
little,
he's
yeah,
he's not right on that. And
yeah.
and Professor Lord has stuff on that too, as does Greg Naj,
Hmm.
uh, who talks about really wonders, at what kind of events would these take place? Would they be
Hmm.
multiple evenings,
Hmm.
that it would go on?
Right,
My
right, right.
friend Margaret, God, her last name is I'll think of it. Margaret Mills,
Mm.
who taught Penn for many years and then at Ohio State. She's retired now, but she's a wonderful scholar. And she collected oral traditions in Afghanistan between the
Ah.
wars, in
Oh,
Russian
wow.
and I think hers were more folktale length,
Mm.
but as opposed to, like epic length. But I think
Mm.
also they could vary in, how much time do you have? What's the
Right,
occasion?
right, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And you want to be responsive to that. Now,
Hmm.
once you're writing stuff down, maybe
Hmm.
you're responsive to different demands or different, you may,
Hmm.
you're not dealing with maybe it's not a crowd interacting with you there.
Right, right,
Are
right.
you imagining them, or do you have another,
Hmm.
kind of thing in mind? And again,
Hmm.
David Carr's work would probably be relevant there that,
Yeah, yeah.
in writing it down and writing it down a particular way, are you leaving something with in mind that, okay, here's this written text
Right, right.
in this set form?
Man, it is so fun to talk to you. I mean, you've been, uh, I mean, from the beginning of serious study into, field study, connecting field studies to cross-cultural studies to, literary studies. I mean, you've experienced so much in this field. It's so fun to get to talk to you about it. I'm curious, do you have like a favorite story in the Hebrew Bible? Like one that always speaks to you, captivates you?
It's interesting. I love them all, and I always find new things in them. That's the other
Hmm.
thing too, that it must be layered and rich because I've been doing this a long time and always. But I think a super favorite of mine is perhaps one of the less oral traditional works in the Hebrew
Hmm.
Bible, is the Book of Ruth.
Uh-huh.
I think it's just I'm always finding new things in it. The
Mm.
way the author creates characters and how they
Hmm.
interact. Um,
Hmm.
and again, it's your traditional rags to riches, kind of thing,
Right. Right.
asking all those heavy kind of ethical and theological questions about why bad things happen to good people.
Right.
And I really like, and it's so brief. It's just so done.
Yeah.
It's just kind of perfect.
Yes. Like every word is used like it's so compact and precise and
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
there's not a lot of wasted uh
No,
verbiage
it's
there.
that's why I said that I really, you don't know who they are, but I just have so much respect for these authors. I think we can call
Hmm.
these kind of creative writers who again are capable of making using traditional
Hmm.
kind of stories and stuff, but making us feel certain ways, about the characters and raise certain unanswerable questions.
Hmm.
Um, I really like the Book of Ruth. I love the way it really focuses on the way, bad things happen to good people
Hmm.
or
And
no,
what do
and
you
they
do
don't.
with that, right?
What do
Yeah.
you do with that?
Yeah.
And God takes away, and then God gives, and you
Hmm.
just you just
Yeah.
you've been the same throughout.
Right. Right.
Uh, but I think it's a really really nice story. Yeah, that's my favorite these days. I find myself going back to that.
And you think that Ruth, you said it was maybe one of you think it was originally just written by a single, you think it has a single author as its source?
I sort of do. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful little kind of short story or novelette or something like that. In fact, when I studied this Hebrew all these years, and I,
Hmm.
I went all the way through high school as well. In fact, if you'd told me at another place in another part of Boston, which was really a sort of, like more serious, I don't know how I did it because we
Hmm.
would finish regular school and then have to drive into Brookline from
Yeah.
another town in the South Shore where I lived. And it was a
Mm.
long drive in, and it snowed a lot in those days. It snowed. So how our parents, we used to carpool, how our parents let these inexperienced 60, it's a miracle. I always tell my students it's because I was studying Talmud that they rejected me because we were all and some of the guys they drove too fast on these scary streets. Anyway, that's another story. But
Uh,
yeah, I did a lot of I don't even know what got me the story of the driving so traumatized me again that I can't even remember what point I was going to make.
I think we're talking about Ruth and about the how
Oh, I
the
remember.
language.
I
Yeah.
remember. Yeah. And I said that, I had studied. So right before so when I got to college, I was said, I'm losing my modern Hebrew. See, we did a lot of modern
Uh-huh.
Hebrew too. It
Uh-huh.
wasn't just you did ancient stuff. You did
Hmm.
Maimonides. And I wish I'd listened better. I was so tired by the time I was there. I really
Yeah.
paid attention to the Bible and the rabbinic stuff, but the others not as
Mm.
much. We read
Ah.
Bialik, we read all these. So at that time, Yosef Yerushalmi taught at Harvard. He finished his career
Mm.
at Columbia, but he was at Harvard in those days when I was
Mm.
an undergraduate. So I said, I am going to ask him if I can audit his uh, Hebrew literature, but it was modern. You were going to
Mm.
read Bialik, you were going to read, all of these poets and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I go in, And what's the first thing we're reading? It's the book of Ruth. But I've always remembered that
Uh,
because it does have this kind of somewhat more modern short story, more of a
sure.
short story than a folk tale.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's late. I mean, people will try to date it in the period of the judges. I really
Hmm.
don't. I think
Sure.
it's fifth century, maybe. Attitudes toward, she's a Moabite after all. It raises all these ethical
Hmm.
issues
Hmm.
about who's the stranger, who belongs, who doesn't belong,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
that are very typical of late biblical stuff.
Yeah.
So
Great questions
anyway,
to ask too. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. My favorite thing about the Book of Ruth is, and this is silly, but my favorite thing is, there's these movies that came out, really dumb slapstick movies, Hot Shots and Hot Shots Part Deux, and one of them was making fun of Top Gun, and so but they're flying in airplanes, and one of the guys' names, his call sign is Dead Meat, and it's like this forecast that the guy is going to crash and burn, but I love that in Ruth, their sons, Naomi's sons, are basically named Sickly and Soon Dead. Like their names mean
I never really thought
their
about that.
names mean like weakly and sickly. It's like it's
What a
like
riot.
let me just
Oh
give you these
dear.
names, and just so you know, they're on their way out. That's got, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm reading my personality into it, but
I'll have to rethink about that. I never thought about that.
I always thought that was kind of like a little piece of
Yeah,
humor in there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love the whole thing where she Naomi has her get gussied up before she, goes to the
Mm-hmm.
floor and stuff.
Yeah.
It's very nice. It's really, really
Yeah.
very nice.
Well, here's a great question, so we'll get more hits on social media. When Ruth uncovers Boaz's feet,
Yeah.
what do you
Oh, I've
what?
always read it in a pure
Oh,
way.
oh man, this Southern Baptist boy in
Yeah.
college,
Yeah.
Bible college, I was like, wait, no, no, what?
Yeah. The
Um,
feet are a euphemism
oh
for
sure.
genitals,
Well,
I mean,
the angels in the throne room with two wings, they covered their feet. Come on, like,
right? And you
yeah.
have even other things with I think the afterbirth comes from between maybe the legs but legs and
Hmm.
feet are both used that way. And um men going to the bathrooms often use that language, that the water comes from it's
Hmm.
definitely, there's no question about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's interesting too. She comes to him balat, which is like quietly, silently. That also, I
Hmm.
think, has sort of um romantic,
Hmm.
sensual kind of notions of that there. There's a kind of,
Hmm.
romance involved.
Yeah.
Uh, have to think about that when I'm,
Yeah. Well,
order
one
to
way,
escape.
you know, yeah, one way or the other, it is, Boaz was such a good, gracious
Oh,
man through the whole thing.
absolutely.
Maybe he just covered her with his cloak, and then
Right.
went and
Right.
talked to the right guys to be able to marry her,
And he
and did
appreciates
right.
her because she's taken such good care of this older woman,
Yeah.
that she's
Yeah.
left her family and to come. And I love the way he has people pull
Mm.
out more sheaves for her, and gives her. And there's all of this language about, famine and plenty. It's really
Yeah.
beautifully,
It is.
beautifully done.
Well, and how Alter says it's almost like this extended well, the betrothed at the well scene, which is
Yeah,
it's
yep,
a
yep,
beautiful piece of literature.
yep.
It would be a great Hallmark love story movie, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
Oh,
Dr. Niditch, I want to be respectful of your time, and goodness gracious, I mean, I'll probably edit this little part out right here, but I'd tell you, there's times I was sitting here and we were talking, I was like, I am talking to Susan Niditch, and we are talking. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I gush. It's part of my personality. I'm working on it. But so fun. But is there anything else that what we're talking about, folklore, oral tradition, the Hebrew Bible? Like, is there like something that whoever listens or watches needs to know about what we've been talking about that we haven't discussed? Is there anything you want to leave people with in reading the Hebrew Bible for what it was from the culture that left it to us, or the cultures that left it to us? Are there any final words?
Well, as I've kind of moved along, and writing different things and being interested in different things, I will say what's come to interest me a lot in recent years are questions about ethics in the Hebrew
Mm-hmm.
Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and even more recently, questions about the way we describe the other.
Uh-huh.
And I think these that's a really important ethical theme.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it comes through the legal tradition, which also in itself is traditional. You have the
Mm-hmm.
laws in
Mm-hmm.
more than one place, and they're given in
Mm-hmm.
a certain way. And
Yeah.
but that those kinds of messages come through this kind of as you say, kind of folkloric traditional literature, I think
Mm-hmm.
is give rise to making you think about some of these sort of themes in ethics. That this kind of literature, in other words, can be very deep and
Mm-hmm.
meaningful. And it's not, to talk about it as being traditional or folkloristic is not to say, oh, it's kind of lightweight or something like
Uh-huh.
that.
Yeah.
It can really, I've done all this stuff on war, but all of that is in, and of course Homer does the same thing, right? In what
Mm.
he writes, that
Mm.
these are so entertaining and they're again so traditional, and they're using, and he has to go with a metric system and so on and so forth.
Mm.
But he raises so many issues about men and women and about the self and
Mm-hmm.
the other and about, what is proper and moral treatment and what isn't and what we should mourn over. And,
Mm.
I think, any great collection of literature like that,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's what makes it great, you know,
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
those kinds of worries behind it. It's the message as well as the medium that
Yes.
traditional forms make you think about.
Yeah. Yeah. I really believe that letting the Bible be what it is
Hmm.
makes it like what you it makes it more beautiful, makes
Hmm.
it more powerful, makes it
Hmm.
more uh, potent to help us be human together.
I agree. I think that's really true. Yeah.
Well, I know, Dr. Knight, you have a, a commentary on Jonah that is came out recently, and you have other works coming out too on biblical ethics. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the most recent thing is this book, Ethics in the Hebrew Bible and Beyond. And I
Mm.
look at various, ethical issues in biblical, and the beyond is the rabbinic stuff. Well, what do the rabbis do with all of these laws and economic ethics, in one particular passage? So, my usual stuff, kind of a lot of close reading and seeing what I can derive from it. And these days, I'm working on a collection of essays that deal basically, I think I'm going to call the book Perfect Strangers, if it becomes a book.
Mm.
But, it's about dealing with the other, which is
Hmm.
other people have. Laura Quick has written some really nice stuff on how people dress, and how that's self-defining, and there are all kinds of things you can look at to
Mm.
to certain kinds of vocabulary. So I have one chapter basically on ethnic slurs, the
Hmm.
Bible and other things.
Yeah.
How do we think of ourselves and how do we think of the other? So
Yeah.
I think that's an important theme these days. So.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
But
Because
I
maybe.
think, as you say, recognizing that this is all framed and comes forward in these traditional media,
Hmm.
is important. So you never forget that.
Yeah. So good. Well, Dr. Niditch, thank you again so much for your time,
Okay,
and it was a
my
pleasure
pleasure.
talking with you.
Okay, talk
All right.
soon.
Bye.